Hello, this is the We Are Not Invisible podcast. I'm your host, Ellie Parks. Today's podcast is called Christmas Memories. I have always loved Christmas. As a child, there was Santa, of course. But when I look back at Christmas, the things I remember are not gifts, but the atmosphere, traditions, and people that I spent time with. We didn't really have a lot of money for gifts, but we would always get something special. Right after Thanksgiving, the Sears and Montgomery Ward toy catalogs would come out. My brothers and I would spend hours looking through it. By the time Christmas arrived, the catalog was in tatters. I don't remember showing anything to my parents that I looked at, but I always got something that was in the catalog. I suspect my oldest brother, Tommy, probably said something to them. He was 8 years older than I was, and so when I was just 4, he was already 12 and didn't believe in Santa anymore. Truthfully, I think the most memorable gift I received was my first record player and my first album, which was Meet the Beatles. I'm pretty sure that my brother Tommy was responsible for that gift. He was the music lover. I grew up in a small town near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My mom and I would take trips into the city at Christmas time. There were 3 major department stores in the city: Kaufmann's, Gimbel's, and Horne's. We would catch the bus to Pittsburgh down at the end of our street and take the half-hour ride into the city. Pittsburgh is in the shape of a triangle, surrounded by 3 rivers: the Ohio, Allegheny, and the Monongahela. In the wintertime, the chill that came from those rivers would go right through my bones, even though I was dressed like I lived in Alaska. I could see my breath in the air, and sometimes there was snow, and the lights in the city looked magical. It was worth it. As soon as I stepped off the bus, I smelled the city. It was a combination of car and bus exhaust, with the added smells of popcorn and peanuts floating out of the 5 and dime stores. We would start out at Kaufmann's, which was on 5th Avenue. They always had beautiful window displays, and it was beautifully decorated on the inside. There was this ornate iron clock that hung on the corner of the building. Everyone knew that clock, and so it was a popular place to meet your friends when you were going into the city. We didn't have a lot of money, so we always shopped the bargain basements of Kaufmann's, never the upstairs. Then we would head to Horne's, where at Christmas they had a huge Christmas tree that hung on the corner of the whole building. I don't ever remember going into Horne's at all as a kid. It was more of a high-end department store. Next, we went to Gimbel's. That is the department store I remember going into the most because their prices were geared more for middle-class clientele. I don't remember buying much on those trips. It was just really to see the decorations. Then we would go to one of the 5 and dime stores to have lunch. They had the old-fashioned lunch counters with the red stools and white counters. The waitresses always wore dress uniforms, and their hair was always under a hairnet. I also remember that most of them wore that same red lipstick that my mom always wore. The food tasted great after walking around in the cold air. We also had hot chocolate as well. After lunch, we would normally head home. We always decorated a lot during the holidays. I think it was more my dad than my mom. My dad always hung Christmas lights around the eaves of the living room roof, the front porch, and hung lights in the pine trees that were close to the house. There were 4 big trees in the yard. Each one belonged to one of the children. He always bought a live tree with the roots, never a cut tree. He would bring it into the house and sit the whole root ball in a giant galvanized tub. He trimmed away the limbs that were low on the tree and saved them to hang from the wood beams on the living room ceiling. We decorated the tree on Christmas Eve, never before. The lights on the tree were the big ones. They didn't have many lights back then. One burnt-out bulb did not take out the whole string. Our living room had doors with windows that opened up to the yard on 2 sides. The tree was always in the corner of those 2 walls so that when you walked up the sidewalk, you could see the tree from both angles. We would traipse up to the attic to get the box of ornaments. Some of them had come from my grandparents. Most of the ornaments were glass, so they were always wrapped in paper. We also made ornaments. They sold these rolls of aluminum foil like strips, and you would take a pencil and roll it up to make a tube. There were 6 tubes per ornament. After the tubes were made, they were tied in the middle and looked like stars or flowers. They were beautiful. When I was older, I used to make wreaths from computer cards that they used on the huge computers and spray painted them gold or silver. I usually got the cards from my ex-husband because he was going to school for engineering. My dad hung the lights on the tree and we kids decorated it. We hung icicles on the tree. Some people hung them really neatly off each of the branches. Not us. We tossed those suckers, and wherever they landed, that's where they stayed. Some people used something called angel hair. It was basically fiberglass strands, which we now know were toxic. Did look pretty though, and made the lights glow. We used a white sheet to cover the tub. A Lionel train was put under the tree, O gauge, which is a big train. Just a circular track that ran around the base of the tree. I remember there were a few little houses in a giant oil rig that my grandfather made that sat next to the houses. Eventually we stopped putting them under the tree, and my brother would put a whole setup in the basement of HO trains with all the houses and trees. It was magical. It took up half of one side of the basement. All the little houses lit up, and some of the things moved, like the ice skaters or the train crossing signs. My dad would take the leftover branches that he had trimmed from the bottom of the tree and nailed them to the beams of the ceiling. He hung red Christmas bulbs on them and icicles. We had a brick fireplace with a large beam as the mantel. We strung garland and lights across it and hung our Christmas stockings on it. Back then, you got tiny gifts and mostly fruit and nuts in your stocking. There was a Santa Claus that hung from the ceiling. It was pretty much stayed up all year. The house was always smelling of pine and something baking that time of the year. For weeks before Christmas, Mom baked dozens and dozens of cookies. She had this old cookie cookbook. The pages were stained with butter and icing, and it was well loved for sure. She made spritz cookies, thumbprints, fruit and nut, walnut balls dipped in powdered sugar, sugar cookies, pizzelles flavored with anise, and deep-fried cookies called rosettes. Then they were sprinkled with powdered sugar. They looked like funnel cakes. A few days before Christmas, my dad made bread and sticky buns. The smell of that fresh bread was heavenly. He always made several loaves because inevitably we would always eat a whole loaf right out of the oven and then smothered it with butter. My dad's side of the family were Slovenian, so he also made something called patitsa. It's a nut roll made by making a sweet dough rolled out so thin that you could see the table through it. Then spread a mixture of nuts, honey, and spices on top, then roll it up into a spiral. It was delicious. My dad was the cook for all the holidays. He would get up at 4 in the morning to get the turkey in the oven. We always had a huge turkey, at least 24 pounds. He would make his stuffing, and yes, he put it inside the turkey, not in a separate pan. I can remember taking spoonsful when he wasn't looking, which when I look back now wasn't a great idea because there were raw eggs in it. Yet here I am, still alive years later. My mom usually did the sides like the green beans, mashed potatoes, and sweet potatoes. We never had fresh cranberries, only the jellied ones. To this day, I still like those the best. We always listened to Christmas music while the food was being prepared. One of my favorite things to listen to was Arthur Fiedler and the Boston Pops. They played a song called A Christmas Festival, written by Leroy Anderson. I will post the link to it in the description of this podcast. We always went to midnight mass on Christmas Eve. I loved going. The church we attended was an older church with a lot of stained glass windows and stone statues. When the inside was lit at night, the stained glass windows were beautiful. The mass was always long, and we sang all the traditional Christmas hymns. My favorite part was walking out of church at night because sometimes we had snow. Snow was so magical at night. The street lights lit the snow falling, and the lights that people had on their houses would reflect all the colors onto the snow. There was that silence that comes with a heavy snowfall. The snowflakes are porous and effectively absorbs sound waves as they fall and accumulate, trapping air between the ice crystals and essentially muffling the noise, almost like soundproofing the air. There was this fresh smell that also occurred when it snowed. It is caused by the snowflakes trapping air. Depending where you are living, in the city or in a rural area, the smell is different. When in a rural area, the smell is more woodsy and fresh. But in an urban area, it's more of an oily smell because of the pollution. We lived in a very small town, so the air was always clean and fresh. When we were small, we would open our presents on Christmas Day. As we got older, we started opening on Christmas Eve. I'll be honest, I hated opening them on Christmas Eve. It took the surprise out of Christmas morning. It just felt like another day to me. On the day after Christmas, we always went to my Aunt Mary and Uncle Ted's, where we would usually have dinner and plenty of cookies. On New Year's Eve, we always had a New Year's Eve party. My aunt and uncle, their family, and our friends would come to the house. The party went on until wee hours of the morning. My dad played the accordion and sang Auld Lang Syne, and also he played something that we kids called a boom bass. It had a large metal tin attached to the pole at the bottom, and at the top there were cymbals, and he would tap it on the floor and smack the tin as a drum. Most of the time, people were 3 sheets to the wind by that time. Since my dad had Slovenian ancestry and my mom had German ancestry, there was always traditional food on New Year's Eve. Pork and sauerkraut was a must. It was supposed to bring prosperity in the coming year, although I don't ever remember that prosperity in our family. We always watched the Dick Clark's countdown to New Year's Eve, and when it struck midnight, everyone had a glass of champagne to bring in the new year. Of course, all the aunts did the hugging and kissing thing that old people do. When my big brother got older, he would fire his hunting rifle in the air at midnight. He did reenactments of the Revolutionary War and had a small cannon that he would sometimes fire on New Year's Eve as well. Imagine that sound at midnight. Thankfully, nobody complained about it because most of the neighbors were at my house. Every culture has their traditions surrounding New Year's. Make everyone stay who drove, and he would fix breakfast in the morning. On New Year's Day, we would make our rounds to all my dad's relatives that lived close by. His aunts and cousins were still alive. I can remember going to each house, and at each house they made us eat something, mostly cookies and cakes. And as a kid, I really loved that. Most people kept their tree up until the 7th of January, which is the Feast of the Nativity. I was always sad when the tree would come down. That means going back to school. My dad would take the tree and put it into a tub outside the living room, and when the weather would get warm, he would plant it. He was a conservationist before it was cool to be one. When I got married, I moved to Florida with my husband at the time. I tried to carry on the traditions of baking with my children and decorating the house. My husband always had a race with a neighbor to see who was the first to get the Christmas lights up. Living in Florida, we started earlier with the Christmas decorating. The weather was warm, and so to get in the spirit, we had to start at the beginning of November. We didn't have any family in Florida, so it was intimate Christmas with just us. We went to Pennsylvania once during Christmas when our children were still little, so they could meet all their cousins and experience snow on Christmas Day. It was over a 20-hour drive from South Florida, so we didn't take that trip very often. For some people, Christmas evokes sadness, not just because they miss loved ones who have died, but also because they are mourning Christmases that were not joyful. I grew up with an alcoholic parent, but for some reason my dad loved Christmas. And it was never ruined. He was a kid at heart. He never really had a childhood. His dad died when he was just 11 years old, and he had to quit school and go to work to help support his family. So I think he always just kept that kid alive inside. This time of the year can be a magical time, especially for children. It does not have to be stressful. I know from my own experience that I only remember a few gifts that I received, but I remember the love, the feelings, and the traditions we had. Sometimes we get caught up in the material end of Christmas and forget the love part of Christmas and the essence of giving to others. If possible, pick a name off an angel tree and give a little something to a child who has nothing. Volunteer to help serve meals to people who are less fortunate. Be kind to others while out shopping for gifts and groceries. Remember the people helping you are being pushed to the limit this time of the year. Have a peaceful and loving holiday season, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this podcast.